Hello and welcome to our next Welty at Home discussion. Today we're discussing Volume 1, Chapters 9 through 17 of Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen. I'm Jessica Russell. I'm with the Eudora Welty House and Garden. And before I forget, on behalf of the Eudora Welty Foundation, I want to invite you all to the Welty Lawn this Thursday, September 22nd at 4:30 p.m. when Ron Rash delivers the annual Betty Jolly Lecture. This event is free and open to the public. I also want to mention that there's a little mistake in your Welty at Home newsletter that went out Friday. Some of you may have noticed the link to our last Monday's discussion, and that email is incorrect. We'll fix it next time. But meanwhile, you can still access last week's discussion. The recording to that link in the Welty at Home email that went out on Tuesday, September 13th, has the right one. And before we get started, I'm just going to mention that our fellow Welty at Homer, Joel and Clary, sent a really humorous link that you Austen fans are going to find amusing. So I'm going to send that in the chat. And for housekeeping, remember to ask a question or make a comment. You want to click the reactions button at the bottom of your screen and then click that raise hand button. And that's how we'll know you have something to say. So now I'm going to turn it over to our discussion leaders, Susan Allen Ford, Professor Emerita of Delta State University and editor of Persuasions, the Jane Austen Journal, and Eudora Welty's friend and biographer, Suzanne Marrs, Professor Emerita of Millsaps College. Suzanne?
Thank you. Well, I think we all had a wonderful time talking about Jane Austen last time, and at the risk of being equated with Miss Bingley, I will say how soon one tires of anything but a good Jane Austen novel. Last time we enjoyed ourselves so much that we missed a lot too. So I think Susan will take us back to a key scene in the first 8 chapters, and then we'll move on to talk about the next 9 chapters, and we'll be talking about, as John would have it, some dolts. And I think there's the ideal, the epitome of the dolt appears in these 9 chapters. So we'll talk about the male characters, I think, today primarily. Susan, have I got it right?
Yes, you do.
Right. I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you. So since, Suzanne said we're going to talk about the male characters, but before that, I'd like to step back and look at a couple of scenes that kind of serve as springboards to the novel. And the first one is the Meryton Assembly, where we first meet Bingley and Darcy, and the rest of the characters first meet Bingley and Darcy as well. This is chapter 3. And if you go back and look at it, we see that it actually picks up even before the assembly. So we get a description of Bingley in the first paragraph from the perspective of Sir William Lucas. He was quite young, wonderfully handsome, extremely agreeable, and to crown the whole, he meant to be at the next assembly with a large party. Nothing could be more delightful. To be fond of dancing was a certain step to falling in love. And from there we move to the assembly itself, where we have Bingley and his sisters and Darcy, but particularly Bingley and Darcy introduced. So I guess what I wanted to get you to talk a little bit about is how this scene introduces Bingley and Darcy. What do we see in them? And what does it show us in Elizabeth, or what do they show us in Elizabeth and in the other characters that we're paying attention to? We get a description of them. We get some reaction. Yeah. Did somebody just ping? No.
Let me help out. I'll call on somebody I know who has something to say. Beverly, you know I'm coming to you, didn't you?
I see Harriet too after that.
Well, I've been up since 4 burying the Queen, so I'm a little bit foggy.
Yeah,
I even
me
have
too.
on my Jubilee T-shirt today.
Yeah.
So she's all buried, and so I'm ready to answer, although I may doze off. I think in this chapter, we get right at the beginning the difference in Darcy and Bingley, as far as their personalities go, as far as their characters go. You know, I certainly wouldn't say Mr. Bingley is adult, because I don't think he is, but he does have a whole lot of unbridled enthusiasm. You know, the attributive every time he speaks is cried, you know, Bingley cried. And so he has all this enthusiasm that I think, you know, I don't know, maybe it would be annoying if you were in his in his presence for a long period of time, although he's certainly a really nice man. Darcy, on the other hand, is, you know, from the get-go, reserved, sort of, you know, a dour man. So we have that balance between the two of them right here at the very beginning. And we probably know, you know, as readers, pretty quickly that the Bennett girls will end up with them.
Thank you. Harriet?
So I was just thinking about the importance of dancing and these men and the difference in their relationship to the idea of dance. I think I remember reading this book in graduate school a long, long time ago and thinking about Mr. Darcy's comments on not wanting to dance with people that he didn't know well and not being tempted by Elizabeth, who is attractive enough, but not enough to tempt him to dance. You know, while there is a sense of Mr. Darcy as someone who is has a critical judgment, who is serious, who doesn't want to be, is not going to be in the same society as Lydia, say, and the soldiers. There is a sense of his social unease, I think, that comes across in his relationship to dancing and his reserve, which is interpreted but as pride, and we can decide whether it is, that's what it is. But it does begin a certain prejudice against Mr. Darcy.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. And if we look at that paragraph that first introduces the two of them, in my edition, it's on page 12. This is about the second paragraph, the second page of chapter 3. Mr. Bingley was good looking and gentlemanlike. He had a pleasant countenance and easy, unaffected manners. His sisters were fine women with an air of decided fashion. His brother-in-law, Mr. Hurst, merely looked the gentleman, but his friend, Mr. Darcy, soon drew the attention of the room by his fine, tall person, handsome features, noble mien, and the report, which was in general circulation within 5 minutes after his entrance, of his having 10,000 a year. The gentleman pronounced him to be a fine figure of a man. The ladies declared he was much handsomer than Mr. Bingley, and he was looked at with great admiration for about half the evening, till his manners gave a disgust, which turned the tide of his popularity, for he was discovered to be proud, to be above his company, above being pleased, and not all his large estate in Derbyshire could then save him from having a most forbidding, disagreeable countenance and being unworthy to be compared with his friend. And so we do have that sort of compare contrast thing, but we're also getting kind of interesting points of view here. Cheryl, did you want to say something? Where'd you go?
In that, so I've also been kind of researching the nature of Victorian England. Am I unmuted?
No, you're fine.
Okay, to get a better understanding of the world that Jane Austen is depicting. And she is describing the various character types that you meet in middle and upper class aristocracy. And this, what I'm saying right now isn't going to be a complete thought, but when she gives a full description of Bingley, full description of Darcy, and then for Mr. Hurst, he merely looks the gentleman, even though he has inherited into this wealth. And then there's another scene when when Jane is sick and they're all in the drawing room, and Mr. Hurst like he doesn't participate in anything. He's like taking a nap, or he'll like maybe play a game of whist. And so I think it's important to look at the character types that she's describing in this society.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, I think he's kind of a funny character and an interesting character, because here he's got the social position, which is probably why she married him. And who knows about his money, Mr. Hurst, but he merely looks the gentleman. I mean, what Austen is interested in is acting the gentleman, being gentlemanlike,
right.
gentlemanlike. And that actually becomes a theme that we're going to follow really through a lot of the novel. Who is the true gentleman? What do we mean by that? Yeah,
Monica here. Oops, I'm sorry, Susan, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, that's all right. I was just saying Monica too.
Oh, good.
Well, I love you're drawing our attention to when Darcy is introduced on page 12, because by the end of the next paragraph, his character was decided. I love that it goes from they thought he drew the attention to the tide starts to turn to a paragraph later. His character is decided. He is the proudest, most disagreeable man in the world, and everybody hoped that he would never come there again. That's a really big jump.
Yeah, it doesn't take long. In fact, in the next chapter, the narrator goes back to compare them again, and the last sentence of that paragraph, this is on 18, is Bingley was sure of being liked wherever he appeared. Darcy was continually giving offense. So there we have a more temperate version of this. But I mean, the community, I think, it's one of the things that interests me here. We started, as we were talking about last time, with that community voice. And here now we're really getting a little bit of description of how these different people are looking at him. And then finally, this kind of community judgment that appears and that we keep recurring to. I mean, even later, I was noticing when I was reading Elizabeth's discussion of Wickham, she says, oh no, everybody feels this way about him, So the community perspective is pretty significant and pretty unanimous, it seems like, throughout at least this first volume of the novel. So, we move from that to, from this scene. Well, let me just say one more, or a couple more things about this. Somebody's already brought up the not handsome enough to tempt me. And that I think is really interesting because of the way we see Elizabeth respond. It's also, I think, a sort of romantic comedy, signal to us that if somebody states something like that right at the beginning of a comedy, it's there to be overturned. So, in the next few chapters, we're going to see how she is handsome enough to tempt him. But what about the way Elizabeth responds to this at the scene and then later on?
That's one of my favorite passages too. I might not have judged him. I forget how I said him so harsh. His pride so harshly if he hadn't wounded mine.
Yeah. So she's she's kind of looking at this, you know, sort of from a more rounded perspective. But even before that, she goes off and although she has, this is on page 14, no very cordial feelings toward him. She told the story, however, with great spirit among her friends, for she had a lively, playful disposition, which delighted in anything ridiculous. So we get a sense of her, the way she's able to kind of rebound in some ways from this. Yeah, Harriet?
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. Is she picks up the story and performs it, and mocks herself, and turns it into a pleasure. We gather, you know, over the course of the novel that she's genuinely offended, but she is also delighting in being able to transform this into a social event that gets the whole community behind her. And her story and her liveliness and her imagination.
That's such an interesting way to put it, that she gets the whole community behind her. Because I mean, I think you're right. She doesn't appear to be a victim here in the way she might if you know the story had been told a different way or overheard in a different way. Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Well, so after this, we have the conversation between Elizabeth and Charlotte on marriage. Is that something that you all would like to talk about? The way in which Cheryl, yes. Oops, you're muted.
I have to get to it in my Kindle, but that whole conversation is very important. So I just wanted to say, I think that we should talk about it.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
But I don't have a comment yet.
Okay, well, it's in chapter what? It's the happiness in marriage is a matter of chance chapter. Is it 6? Yeah. It's chapter 6. So in this book, around 23 or so, page 23, what Charlotte is doing here is, you know, recommending that if Jane really wants to capture Bingley, she better get on it, you know, not just kind of let things take their course. So it's a different version, really, of Mrs. Bennet's interest in Bingley, although it's certainly supported by Mrs. Bennet sending Jane off to Netherfield with the hope that it might rain on her so that she won't be able to come back. But here we have a kind of interesting argument between Charlotte and Elizabeth about marriage. Charlotte says, Jane should therefore make the most of every half hour in which she command his attention. When she's secure of him, there will be leisure for falling in love as much as she chooses. And Elizabeth says, well, your plan's a good one when nothing is in question but the desire of being well married. If I were determined to get a rich husband or any husband, I dare say I should adopt it. But these aren't Jane's feelings. She's not acting by design. She doesn't even know yet how, you know, if anything about the reasonableness of her affection. And Charlotte says, this is on 24, I wish Jane success with all my heart, and if she were married to him tomorrow, I should think she had as good a chance of happiness as if she were to be studying his character for a 12-month. Happiness in marriage is entirely a matter of chance. If the dispositions of the parties are ever so well known to each other or ever so similar beforehand, it does not advance their felicity in the least. And Elizabeth says, oh, Charlotte, you know that's not sound, and you would never act this way yourself. So here we have this kind of conflict between the two. Cheryl, do you have something that you're ready to say at this stage? You're still. No, okay. Well, we can just kind of move on really with having that in mind, because we get more on this whole subject of marriage. Mr. Collins' attitude, for instance, about his plans to marry, as well as Mrs. Bennet's. So after these kind of introductory scenes, I think this is sort of the first movement of the novel. Then we shift to the second, which is the visit to Netherfield, which we're thrown into specifically because of Mrs. Bennett's desire to get Jane and Bingley to spend more time together. What kinds of things there are a number of scenes or focuses, I guess, to those few chapters at Netherfield. There's a lot of commentary on Elizabeth's walking across the fields. There's a lot of comment and discussion about what it means to be an accomplished woman. We have a discussion of Elizabeth as a studier of character. We have a discussion of how persuadable Bingley is. And we have Elizabeth and Darcy arguing about laughing at people, at vanity, at pride. So what's Austen doing for us in this section of the novel? How does this, what starts to emerge in terms of our attitudes toward Bingley and Darcy, or Elizabeth, or for that matter, the Bingley sisters?
Cheryl has her hand up.
I'm ready. It helped me to go back to look at, so how did London, England get to this Victorian age, right? And all the structures, the rules of engagement with each other. So before that, I think it was like the Renaissance in the 16th century or something. And before that, it was like everyone was doing the hunter-gatherer thing together. So the female-male roles were kind of equal. But as we were able to establish farms and homes, and women could have more children, the role of the woman began to change. So she was more attached to the home. And so for the middle and upper classes, that gave the women more leisure time. So by the 17th century, the women began to be accomplished in things like learning French and needlework and that kind of thing. So there's a line in Jane Austen's society in being accomplished and being too accomplished. And Elizabeth Bennet is perceived by the Bingley sisters as being too accomplished and prideful. She'd prefer to sit and read a book than to participate in idle gossip.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting, and I mean, there's a whole literature of a whole conduct literature that's being written through the 18th century and into the 19th, where we are now, that talks about not just how to behave, but how to educate women. And you can really see Darcy, I think, in this conversation coming out of what an accomplished woman is or should be. His reading, I think, of the conduct literature, as well as Miss Bingley's. And what Miss Bingley is focused on is the kind of what are often thought of as kind of external accomplishments: needlework, dancing, knowledge of languages, that sort of thing. And what Darcy focuses on is the improvement of the mind by extensive reading. And in fact, the improvement of the mind is actually a title of a conduct book, or or Letters on the Improvement of the Mind by Hester Chapone. So yeah, I mean, I think we said a couple of minutes ago that this is largely about, or the novel is partly about what a gentleman is. It's also about what a lady is, or a woman, and what kinds of things she needs to be. And the Bingley sisters are going to look askance at Elizabeth for multiple reasons. Beverly, do you want to?
Well, I was just going to say about Elizabeth, you know, what is this, about the third chapter that we're talking about now, maybe on into the fourth. She is obviously emerging as the main Bingley, other than her father, who has any sense. And I even put Jane in there. I mean, Jane is quiet and meek and ladylike, but she lets things happen to her.
Mm-hmm.
You know, even the fact that she lets her mother send her out when she knows she's going to get caught in a rainstorm and probably end up with pneumonia, and have to, you know, she's sacrificing her daughter to put her in this position so she can snag this man, and Jane goes along with it.
Mm-hmm.
But Elizabeth seems to be a much more modern woman
Mm-hmm.
than anybody else. I mean, I mentioned the Mean Girls last week. The Mean Girls are even meaner. You know, they even get meaner as we go along. And even though I know Jane is, you know, one of the heroines, she's sort of milquetoasty and doesn't take a lot of responsibility for what she wants
Mm-hmm.
or for her own future, whereas Elizabeth does.
Mm-hmm.
She's much more modern to me.
Uh-huh. Yeah, that's interesting. And I think that's something that we might want to talk about some more, is what makes her seem as modern as she does. Harriet?
So I was thinking about adding Mr. Collins' version of femininity to the discussion. I mean, Mr. Collins is actually, you know, reading from Fordyce's sermons on the model of womanhood, and when he wants to praise Elizabeth, he talks about her modesty, which doesn't seem to us to apply to at all. But it is his version of femininity is modest, agreeable, servile, frugal, so we do have the tremendous gap between what we're constructing as Mr. Darcy's version of the ideal woman and Mr. Collins.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and also it sort of, in a way, to me, picks up what Charlotte Lucas is saying about how you don't really know the person who you're thinking of marrying until, you know, after you've been married to them for a while, because what we've got are these kind of you know, selves, in a way, that are, or masks that people are, or to pick up your earlier word, performances that people are giving of femininity or masculinity. Elta?
Back to your question about the Elizabeth as a modern woman, to me, Elizabeth is unable to disguise how intelligent she is. Mm-hmm. And she sees through all of this, but she has such a sense of humor about it. She's not prone to look down on people, but simply to be delighted by or irritated by the foibles of the people around her. But she can't hide her intelligence, and just a delightful character.
Yes.
Beyond delightful.
Yes, please. Thank you.
Yeah. Marion? Oh, you're muted.
Marion.
going back to Elizabeth as a modern woman, I think it's the best example is when she strikes out across the field. It's just such a visual image. She's being active and she's defying the wishes of her mother. I just think that's a wonderful illustration of what we're talking about.
Yeah, I mean, I love that passage about springing, over puddles and jumping over stiles. And I mean, she says it's only 3 miles, no big deal. And of course she gets there and Jane is sick in bed. So, I mean, there's a real contrast there between Elizabeth and Jane, but also between Elizabeth and the Bingley sisters, who can't get over the fact that she is, she's got mud on her, the last 3 inches of her petticoat. So, I mean, we just get this sense of Elizabeth's energy and life in a very physical way. Yeah, Mary?
Yes, I think that Elizabeth is such a strong character. She's going to need a strong man in her life. And I noticed the use of a word, an adjective, an adverb that I rarely hear, and that is the word arch. And it is, I don't know if anyone else noticed the word, it is used to describe Elizabeth. It means, according to my little phone dictionary, playfully roguish or mischievous, and an obsolete meaning, a person who is preeminent, a chief. And it fits her. But even to me, the word, when you say the word, it has like a strong backbone to it. It has a strong sound. And I don't know, this might have been said before, but my edition has an essay by J.B. Priestley. And the title that Jane Austen original title she had picked out the book was First Impressions. And it is so very much a book about changing perspectives. And I love it because, how often do we have a first impression that we become married to, and then we learn something and, we're there changing our minds, we're maybe humbly having to say, hey, maybe I'm wrong. And as y'all have all said, this book is so charming in a way because there is a community consensus about behavior. And I'm old enough to have grown up when there was something of that. Because I remember if there was a lady who was sort of past her prime to get married, my mother and her sisters would go, well, she's not a spring chicken anymore. And, so there was a kind of judgment. If you didn't marry by a certain age, that you were going to be looked at as askance. And you really see that as we all know, for all kinds of reasons, for not being able to be independent and take care of yourselves. But there was a stigma. And I think even when I was growing up, even maybe a little bit today, there is a stigma if someone is not married by a certain age.
Yeah, and we see that here with Charlotte Lucas, who's 27. That is old, at least not to be married. And we see, just the way Mrs. Bennet keeps saying, oh yeah, well, Charlotte Lucas, not handsome, not beautiful, not like my daughters. So there's a real sense of hierarchy depending on, when and who's married and when they're married. Jacob.
I think I agree with just about everything everybody has said about Elizabeth's sparkling positive qualities. I'd also like to add, or what really struck me with this reading was what seemed to me at least one pretty obvious vulnerability, which is to say her intense awareness of and sensitivity to class. I thought Jane Austen is remarkable in this at depicting two families from two different class statuses and the way in which they kind of bounce off each other with some pretty noticeable, what you would call microaggressions. And I really, if there's a modern moment, I was really amazed at the moment where Elizabeth is almost embarrassed by her own mother when her mom comes to Netherfield, and the performance of her mother trying to convince the family to marry her oldest daughter comes across, I think, very obvious to Elizabeth. And for her to be ashamed of her own mother, that seemed to me like very risky ground for a woman writer to write about. So I was really amazed by that, at least. So the sensitivity to class.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And there are lots of gradations in this, because Mrs. Bennet is somebody whose father was just, a country attorney, and she marries Mr. Bennet, who's got inherited property. So they're in this kind of difference. And then we have Mr. Darcy, who's, way up there with 10,000 a year, and as we'll find out later, an uncle who's an earl. And then we've got the Bingleys, whose money is new. And it's a lot of money, so that's good, but it's not, it doesn't put them in the same category as it puts the Darcys. And what you see is are the Bingley sisters really trying to kind of move beyond that. They want him to buy his own estate and establish himself so that he's now landed. They keep making jokes, looking down at Elizabeth and her relatives. So there's a lot of class stuff going on here. And then even when Wickham comes in, what's happening there, but Wickham is mentioning the fact that his father was an attorney who then became Mr. Darcy's steward. And so he's in, another category as well. And that kind of sets up, I think, some sympathy from Elizabeth for him, just because of that class awareness you're talking about. It's really, that's fascinating, really. So, there's a lot going on here.
I was interested that Elizabeth is embarrassed by her mother willfully misunderstanding Darcy when he talks about the lack of diversity in the rural society. On the other hand, I think Elizabeth herself willfully misunderstands Darcy later on and is guilty in a more subtle way of her mother's failing.
Yeah. Maybe the difference is Mrs. Bennet is not willfully misunderstanding, but just misunderstanding.
Incapable of understanding.
Right.
Yeah.
I think it's so interesting because Elizabeth is embarrassed by her mother, but some of that might be class related, but some of it is just intelligence and her mother's lack of propriety, really. Her mother's obviousness in the way she is going after men for her husband. And I don't know, I sort of feel like most people at some point or another are embarrassed about their parents, especially at this age. When you're 19, 20, you don't really want to be around them too much. Maybe that I'm telling something I shouldn't about myself, but it seems to me like that's a young person's feeling, I guess. And
That's what I wrote in the chat.
Who said that?
Cheryl.
This is Monica.
Monica.
I think that one of the eternal appeals of this novel is being a young woman with siblings and an embarrassing mother and embarrassing relatives.
Yeah, at some point, an embarrassing whole family. They don't know how to behave. And but yeah, I think you're right.
Mr. Bennett, well,
Go ahead.
Mr. Bennett is interesting to me because he does claim our sympathy and he is so much more intelligent than his wife, but then he also doesn't know how to behave.
Yeah, I mean, and you can really see even at this stage that he's not really doing his job.
Yeah.
You know, he's going to the library, he's having fun with Mr. Collins until he's too tedious, and then he says, go for a walk with my daughters. You know, I mean, he's not really doing the kinds of things that the father needs to be doing here, even though he's so much fun to read as a character. Beverly?
I play devil's advocate a little bit about Miss Bingley, although she gets on my nerves. And of all of the, when you look at all the different versions of Pride and Prejudice, some of them she's just a caricature and is, so annoying. But when Elizabeth is worried about or embarrassed by her family, by her mother, by Lydia's, dare I say, slutty behavior, it's with good reason, because at this time, when Lydia goes off and ruins herself, or could have had Darcy not intervened and gotten her married, she would have been ruined for life. Mm-hmm. So the worry that Elizabeth has over the behavior of her family, and at this time in history, is a very valid worry. And Lydia, isn't even bright enough to realize that she was saved from, being a social outcast forevermore. She just thinks she lucked up and got Wickham. And so, the business about about Elizabeth being embarrassed, she sees, I think, problems where her mother does not. Mm-hmm. And so it's more than just embarrassment. I mean, it's the recklessness that her mother is displaying here.
Yeah, I think, well, and I mean, Elizabeth also recognizes that probably the best way to encourage a husband is not to let it be shown that you're doing that, So, I mean, she has for sure a kind of more reasonable way of understanding these social dynamics than, so it's not just, it's not just class issues, it's not simple embarrassment, it's concern, and not to give anything away or too much away, but there's a point later on in the novel where Elizabeth, worries aloud to her father about what kind of judgments people are going to be making about the Bennet sisters if the behavior of the younger ones isn't reined in some. So, yeah, Cheryl.
And that's interesting because there seems to be some self-contradiction in what Jane Austen is doing, because Elizabeth is a bit of a rebel, but then she's also conscious of social protocols, mm-hmm. and can be embarrassed by them. And I thought Jacob was like what he was talking about regarding class is so incredibly accurate. And it makes me wonder if Austen's perception of her society was that it was one in transition, because and if the value of, I couldn't find it yet, but basically when Collins is describing Miss de Bourgh and her sickliness, and I think this is still within our, up to chapter 17 window. Yeah. He says that, no, Lady de Bourgh says that her daughter is the most handsome, or still the most handsome. You know what? I'm going to find the passage.
I found it. Okay, this is in our edition. It's in chapter 14, and in my edition, it's on page 66. She's a most charming young lady indeed. Lady Catherine herself says that in point of true beauty, Miss de Bourgh is far superior to the handsomest of her sex, because there is that in her features which marks the young woman of distinguished birth.
Right. So so she's commenting on the class structure,
Mhm.
and you automatically are associated with being superior. Yeah. Okay. That's the end of my comment. Thank you.
Mhm. Well, I mean, and I also, just to hop back a little bit, I like too what you said about the fact that Elizabeth is both very, has some rebelliousness and individualism, but yet is aware of the social protocol, so that the rebellion doesn't go too far. She's kind of, she's got an interesting social awareness, I guess I'd say. Yeah, Harriet?
So adding to the relationship between mother and daughter, and going beyond embarrassment, there is this pattern in women's fiction where there is a difference between one generation and the next, and the difficulty of being a daughter without a model for how to be a woman in a more modern way. And I'm thinking about the tensions between mother and daughter along those ways. I'm also thinking that I think we've talked about and I heard this in Suzanne's comment and in Jacob's, but I just wanted to kind of underline it, that what, given that Mrs. Bennet is so emphatic about the need for social class status, Elizabeth has class prejudice. I mean, Elizabeth is in her attitude towards Darcy. I think there is an element of her, or in her relationship with Wickham, there's an element of class prejudice against upper classes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's really interesting. I want to move back just for a second to something you said earlier about the generational differences. Jane Austen herself has a letter she's writing to her sister and talking about how she went somewhere and the mother of the family was darning socks in the drawing room, and she says, "Don't tell about that at home, or we might be having the same thing." So, I mean, it's clear that she's got, some embarrassment about her own mother sometimes too. So I think you're right. It is that kind of, "'twas ever thus" aspect. But since you're bringing up Mr. Wickham, and we also want to get to the dolt, let's talk about those chapters in which, after we get back from Netherfield, here comes Mr. Collins, and then in 2 more chapters we get Mr. Wickham. So they, we set up the whole, relationships and then develop them further in the Netherfield scenes, and then we bring in these 2 other men. Why? I guess. What are their functions, and why put them in, one after another? Or what would you like to say about Mr. Collins's doltishness? Yeah, Monica.
Well, first of all, something I find fascinating about Mr. Collins is I spent some time reading a whole bunch of spinoffs of Pride and Prejudice, because people have just written so many spinoffs, and people really enjoy killing off Mr. Collins, like in really dramatic. There's one book that he gets into a beehive, he's stung hundreds of times, which makes him fall into a pond and drown. I mean, people love torturing Mr. Collins. But I think it's wonderful that we start off set up with this, this entailment of, the estate is entailed to this distant male relative. And then the reveal of the distant male relative is so ridiculous, that he's such a ridiculous person. I think that I don't know if she's calling into question or showing the, adding a whole other layer of anxiety to the entailment.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, it couldn't get any more anxious in a way, because that money is gone unless Mrs. Bennet or Mr. Bennet have a son who is not illegitimate. So that, those Bennet girls are unprovided for. And yeah, so here comes Mr. Collins and Mrs. Bennet's question earlier, why should he have it more than anyone else is dumb. But on the other hand, it's also a good question. Why should he have it? More than anyone else. It's just the world, this kind of world of primogeniture that we're or that they are enmeshed in. And so here comes Mr. Collins as this sort of buffoonish character. My favorite sentence, I think, is when somebody asks, Mrs. Bennet asks if Lady Catherine lives near him. And he says, the garden in which stands my humble abode is separated only by a lane from Rosings Park, her ladyship's residence. And that's such a long and drawn out way of saying she lives across the street from me. But he gets at his kind of ponderous nature. Yeah, Cheryl?
So I actually, I sympathize with Mr. Collins, and I think that his clownishness is a result of trying to fit himself to this elevated environment that he's in, because, and I gave up on trying to find the references because I have a Kindle, I have the Audible version, and I have a paperback. So, but something about his father didn't really teach him social graces. So when he went off to clergy school and then looks into de Bourgh's patronage, he's now been really elevated into a different society, and he's trying to adjust, in my opinion, his mannerisms and his patterns of speech. And that's why there's so much padding and peacocking and just making a statement. He's got to put all these extra words in it to fit the gentry.
Mm-hmm.
So I sympathize for him, and I have not yet been able to decide, determine what I think about Mr. Bennet's parenting, because this is my first read, and I just don't think that he doesn't have the same sense of urgency as Mrs. Bennet, but he does care about his daughters, and he supports Lizzie when she declines the Collins proposal, which could have helped.
We've got frozen there.
Yeah.
I
Well,
think-
yeah, I was just going to say, Cheryl was talking about that stuff at the beginning of chapter 15, where his life, or the first part of his life, had been spent under the guidance of an illiterate and miserly father, and it talks about the subjection in which his father had brought up. And so what he gets out of that is a mixture of pride and obsequious and self-importance and humility, all of these things that kind of combine to make that pompous and yet servile affect that he has.
I think Elta had something.
Elta?
Well, then I lowered my hand because I was following up. I had exactly the same thoughts that Cheryl had, and I was interested this time because he is such a buffoon, and it's hilarious reading about him. But she does show a tiny bit of empathy for what created him, but that's all.
Yeah, it's interesting that the narrator shows the empathy, but Elizabeth does not. Well, Elizabeth doesn't know, but what Elizabeth and the rest of the Meryton society see are just, Mr. Collins' performance. Yeah, Harriet?
I'm just thinking about the vision of the church that we get in the book between Mr. Collins and Mr. Wickham, both thinking of the church as good living rather than something else. And in Mr. Wickham's case, it is it's an astonishment to think that that he would think that he is suitable for the church. But he does, yeah, and because it's a good living and one that he's entitled to.
Yeah, and Austen's father and her older brother were Church of England clergymen. So I mean, she's involved in that kind of world and that way of thinking, I think. Or at least partly, Yeah, Monica?
I'm thinking more about what Harriet said, and I'm wondering if there's any effective parent in this novel. Maybe part of it is that it's difficult to be an effective parent, given what you need to do for your children. Maybe the aunt and uncle, maybe her aunt and uncle who she goes on the trip with, or maybe Darcy's parenting of his sister, sort of. But it seems like part of this novel's problem is we don't have any good parents who are shepherding their children into society.
Yeah, I think that's very interesting. Elizabeth is kind of mentor-less at this stage. I think Charlotte Lucas, the older young lady, is kind of in that role, but you can see that they're not, they're more equals than anything else. Yeah, Pearl?
I'm thinking about how Welty, when she was reading Spotted Horses by Faulkner, or thinking about that, she said, "Oh, I would kill to be Mrs. Littlejohn," who is the owns the house where the horse runs through and sees Ratliff in his underwear. And so I'm going to actually put Suzanne on the spot here, as she's done to me. And we know what Welty thought academically when she's writing, the comparison to Mary Alice. We know what she's thinking as the writer when she writes her beautiful essay about the comedy. But what do you think? And I'm not trying to make you think like Welty, but what do you suppose Suzanne Welty thought about these women in this class? And does she think about Elizabeth being the modern woman, but having to live within this constricted society? I mean, what do you think? Or what did you think she might find the comedy here beyond what she tells academically?
Well, I was thinking, here is Eudora, who doesn't marry, who is more than 27, but who would not make a marriage of convenience. And I think who would agree with maybe with that Darcy's standards for women and Elizabeth's standards for marriage are more designed to make for a happy life than acceptance of the convention that Charlotte preaches.
Yeah.
But Eudora did love reading Jane Austen. She said she read her almost annually, I think. So
was this her favorite novel, or do you know?
I don't know. She loved all 6. So
where are we time-wise, Jessica?
we have 1
2
minute.
minutes.
Oh,
Minutes? Okay. Well, I was going to say, what about Wickham? And maybe Wickham is somebody we need to talk about next week. I do have a couple of things. One, I was showing Suzanne and Jessica before we got started. It's the 10-pound note, which has Jane Austen's face on it, a Victorian version of her face, actually, so prettied up. And it has on it underneath as a quotation, "I declare, after all, there is no enjoyment like reading." Miss Bingley's language, but apparently supposed to be Jane Austen's. I just thought that was fun, since we came across that scene today.
I have one funny story I want to tell, and it's totally irrelevant to anything we've been discussing, but our friend David McWhirter told me he had a friend who went to Chawton House, where Eudora's brother lived, Edward Knight. Is that correct? If I got the name right, Susan?
Yes.
Edward Knight. And the guide was showing them around, and these people who were on the tour said, "Oh, they said, Jane Austen had dinner at this table." And all these people said, "Oh, can we sit down at the table? Can we sit down?" And they sat in every chair because they wanted to make sure that their bottom had been on the very chair where Jane's bottom had been. So hooray for Janeites around the world.
Well, so next week, I think I'd like to start by talking a little bit more about Mr. Collins and Mr. Wickham. And then we'll move into the Netherfield Ball, which we've been told is coming, and the conclusion of volume 1. And as you know, this is a 3-volume novel, but I think it's pretty clear that Austen had these volume sizes in mind as she was writing, because there's a real shape to each of the volumes. And so we'll get to a kind of interesting stopping point at the end of volume 1.
All right, we'll see you guys next week. We'll be discussing volume 1, chapters 18 through 23. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Read on.
Yes.
Thank you so much.